Hi everyone, Larry, Curly and Mo here with Rhyme Signatures, the nerdiest music review this side of first learning who the Three Stooges were from a Meatloaf song, and today we're going to be doing a review of the new Virgilio, Morse and Jennings album, Sophomore. Yes, three of my favourite guys in prog rock are back, and for those who've been with me since the very beginning of the channel, you might remember that I reviewed the dynamic trio's debut album Troika last year, and for those whose memories are sharp as a needle, you'll surely remember that I was quite favourable to the album. While it didn't set my world on fire, it was certainly a worthwhile record, and it's still one that I'll regularly come back to when I'm in the mood for a kind of cosy, cheerful, easy-listening singer-songwriter bit of fun. Now, it felt pretty clear to anyone who's even vaguely familiar with Neal Morse's proclivity that we were going to inevitably get a sequel to this project. But I'll be honest, I wasn't quite expecting the imaginatively titled Sophomore to come along quite so soon. But by the very nature of the music and how it is ultimately quite ephemeral in nature, one can only imagine that the songs here didn't take massive amounts of time to write and perform, which probably explains why we've got a follow-up so relatively soon after the debut. Much like Troika, Sophomore is a collective grab bag of sweet, sentimental, lo-fi and charming songs. There's nothing on here which will challenge you from a musicality perspective or make you think about things on a deeper level of instrumentation, but this is a lyrically enjoyable, melodically rich experience that I've had a good but ultimately fleeting time with. My history with all of the musicians here is quite extensive, and I've followed all of their careers with a considerable amount of interest. I've been a Neal Morse fan since the early days of Spock's Beard, and I still consider The Light to be one of the best debut albums in the prog world. Mr. Virgilio was of course part of Spock's, but I've been thoroughly enjoying his work with Big Big Train of late. And as for Ross, let's just say that I have a copy of Enter the Fifth Dimension lurking around my CD collection somewhere, so it's safe to say I'm pretty familiar with his work too. So I was pretty amped to hear that these guys were teaming up again. After all, those three-part vocal harmonies and simple but well-told stories from Troika left a pretty lasting impression on me, so obviously I was hungry for more of what came before, but also hoping for a little bit of a step up in the songwriting, maybe something more intricate, maybe more personal and interesting. A build-up from the foundations laid by the first album, if you will. Sophomore doesn't quite hit the levels I was hoping for, I'll be honest with you right off the bat with this. I do ultimately feel that Troika is the stronger offering, and that while some of Sophomore's individual songs are much better, the experience and overall impact of this album can't quite hold up to the enjoyment that I felt from Troika. Now, I'm not dismissing Sophomore, far from it. This is still embracing that familiar, cosy, jovial mood and atmosphere that its predecessor managed. It just feels like this is, I don't know, more of the same. Neither doing anything new, but also managing to avoid any missteps. It's a very safe record, and that might be exactly what you're looking for. After all, this is not progressive music the guys are writing here. This is singer-songwriter stuff, the kind of easy, straightforward, immediately enjoyable kind of music that we might have seen in the late 60s to early 70s, only with a more modern and introspective self-awareness about it. We've got 11 tracks on here and 2 extra alternative mixes on the bonus tracks version, and while I'm not going to talk about them all individually, I do want to talk a little bit about the highlights and lowlights of the album, just so you'll have an idea of where this record is going. Ultimately, the album does follow a pretty predictable formula, never really straying outside of any expected guidelines. You won't find any track on here that especially sticks out from the others, with one possible exception that I'll get to later. The mood is an overall quite positive one. That much is the one undeniable fact. The guys are clearly having a great time recording this, and it really comes across in how well delivered the vocals are, how clean the instrumentation is, and just how well paced everything feels. None of the songs here really feel like they're dragging on for the simple sake of it. There's a lot of traditional, straightforward structuring. Everything feels warm, comfortable, familiar and recognisable. It's kind of like the musical equivalent of putting on a warm bathrobe, a pair of slippers, and sliding onto a cosy armchair by the fireside on a winter's night. It's comfortable, it's familiar, But in the same breath, it's also a little boring and obvious. Nothing here challenges you or gives off any kind of, timelessness. For better or worse, Sophomore is a flash-in-the-pan record that I'll be enjoying for a month or two and then will likely be shelved, with the exception of one or two favourites that I'll move into an easy listening playlist for when I need a chill-out day. Highlights for me include the album opener Hard to Be Easier, giving me serious vibes of early Spock's beard, not feeling dissimilar to something off of The Kindness of Strangers, but with those, excellent, beautifully mixed three-part harmonies. Neal, Nick and Ross can all be heard clearly, and it's relatively easy to tune your ears to focus on the one you like the most. It's a clean, entertaining, bright and breezy tune that's hard to wear a frown when you're listening to it. You can really feel the joy from everyone involved. Like, all three of them are breaking loose from the shackles of their usual day jobs to make something full of a kind of a joie de vivre, if you will. It's a very strong start to the album and an easy favourite. Tiny Little Fires is another enjoyable track for me, being the second single released from the album and also the shortest song here. The twee, cutesy little glockenspiel intro carries the song wonderfully, setting the scene for one of the most pure bubblegum, grin-inducing tracks on the album. Ross takes the early lead on the vocals and delivers a performance up there with his very best. He sounds so full of life, love and happiness, which is equally reflected in the music. Now, it would be easy to point an accusatory finger of saccharine sweetness at this song, and not unjustifiably so. But I'm having such a goddamn good time with this one that I can forgive the cheesiness and embrace the unrelenting feel-good vibes that this exudes from every second of its runtime. Right Where You Should Be is one of the most poignant, beautiful and heart-wrenching songs that the trio have recorded so far, giving a kind of morose country vibe in its opening seconds. It's a song tinged with regret, sadness and melancholy, but also with a message of hope, of acceptance and playing with the hand you've been dealt. It's a spine-chillingly beautiful ballad and one of the most emotional songs on the record. Ultimately, this album is about stories, individually captured and told with the grace of artists who've been at this for a while now. Despite how long someone like Neal's been doing this songwriting thing, he still manages to tug at the heartstrings, and the harmonising from both Nick and Ross alongside him, with the introspective lyrics, crafts a song that's pure poetry and an easy winner. I'm Not Afraid is another cheeky, bouncy little number that sees DiVirgilio on lead vocals, and his warming and welcoming voice feels like coming home. It's such a friendly-sounding song, full of joy and promise, dancing out across its relative simplicity from an instrumental and melodic perspective. There's nothing particularly adventurous on this song, but the vibe check is so uplifting that it's so hard to do anything other than smile whilst listening to this. Unfortunately, the same cannot be said for one of the other Nick-led songs, that of Mama, which is honestly, for me, one of the worst songs I've heard this year. It's got this really awkward, tough guy swagger at the start, with some incredibly cringy lyrics that honestly made my toes curl up at times. Now, I get that they were going for this sort of knowingly camp, silly and playful vibe here, maybe hoping to channel their inner Krista Berg, but instead of coming across as self-aware, it just sounds a little embarrassing, and I can't wait for the song to finish. Sadly, this one's a hard skip, and for me, one of the worst Neal-associated songs since Agenda off of The Grand Experiment. The last three songs of Weigh Me Down, Walking on Water and Anywhere the Wind Blows all feature a varying number of words beginning with W, and are all of somewhat varying quality for me. Weigh Me Down is perfectly fine, it's a little dull and perhaps a bit too sombre for the album. It's a perfectly okay little ballad, but I just feel it doesn't particularly go anywhere interesting enough to hold my attention for too long. Walking on Water is a far more upbeat, enjoyable song with some great guitar work, a fantastic driving rhythm, killer lead vocals from Ross, and some really great hooks, landing for me as some of the catchiest on the record. The percussive elements are probably where this track stands out the most for me, with a focused intensity sitting underneath Ross's rising crescendos and makes for a memorable and engaging song. And then there's the final song and first single from the album, Anywhere the Wind Blows, which I assume is not an oblique reference to Bohemian Rhapsody, and it's a pretty great send-off to the record. It's a very pure song, featuring some exquisite harmonisation, wonderful choruses, classic Neal stylings, and feels like a perfect setlist closer at a future Morse fest. I'm definitely getting early Morse solo work vibes from this one, and wouldn't bat an eyelid if someone told me out of context that this was a lost B-side from Testimony or One. So what else can I say about DiVirgilio, Morse and Jennings' Sophomore? Honestly, this album, while I've thoroughly enjoyed some individual moments on it, has ultimately left me feeling a little bit apathetic. I loved Troika and was optimistic for this album, but I think that this is evidence that it should have been maybe a one-and-done project. The best songs on this album feel more like they would have fit better on a Neal Morse solo project, or perhaps the strongest cuts should have been saved and another year given to allow their collective ideas to bloom brighter and more interesting and experimental songs to flourish between the guys, with Sophomore being released at some point, I don't know, in 2024 instead. Now, I don't want to come across as a completely negative Nelly about this album. I've still enjoyed it, and where it is strong, it is extremely strong. It just all feels perhaps a little bit too familiar. I'm so used to these guys being at the cutting edge of progressive music, and while I do appreciate that this project is meant to be them scaling things back and taking a more traditional and simplistic route, I don't feel that's a good enough excuse to crutch as hard as they have done on the tried, the tested and the familiar. I think if DMJ are to maintain my interest in this project in the future, they need to take the ideas of what it stands for, being an outlet for their more singer-songwriter ideas, but inject some more of their adventurous creativity into it. Otherwise, it carries the risk of ending up as the progressive singer-songwriter equivalent of elevator music. This is still an album worth your time though. It's around the mid-40s in length, has an undeniable charm and fireside appeal. It's just not doing anything that we've not all heard 100 times before. Now, it's okay to fall back onto something comfortable and non-threatening, but I just feel that this project could be so much more if they just injected a little bit of bite into what they're doing. I'd comfortably recommend that you at least stream this one. It's a great record to vibe to when you have friends over and don't want to overwhelm anyone. I just don't think it's up to any of the musicians' own incredibly high standards for the best of their individual works. This, guys, is all, of course, just my opinion on the record, as you know, so if you have listened to Sophomore, please tell me what you thought about this record in the comments down below. If you did like this video, please do share it around with anyone else who you think would enjoy it, and please do consider subscribing to the channel for more content. I'm going to leave a link to my link tree down below, where you'll find all the places to find me on social media, as well as a link to my Ko-fi page if you're feeling particularly generous and want to help support the growth of the channel. But until next time, guys, as always, keep your rhyme signatures extremely odd.